Some doors don't open by mistake. They open because something on the other side is waiting for you. The Atlantic wind whispered against the glass walls of the private deck as Ethan Blackwood adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit, the ocean stretching endlessly beneath the midnight sky. A kingdom of darkness he understood better than people, because water didn't pretend, it didn't lie. It simply existed with quiet power, much like him. And tonight, aboard the most exclusive cruise liner crossing from Miami to the Mediterranean, every detail had been engineered to perfection, from the polished marble floors beneath his Italian leather shoes to the crystal lights above reflecting a curated illusion of luxury. But perfection had a way of cracking in the smallest, most unexpected moments, and Ethan didn't believe in accidents. Not anymore. Not after building a billion-dollar empire from calculated decisions and controlled risks. Yet as he stepped away from the gala crowd, leaving behind champagne laughter and shallow conversations, something pulled him down the quieter corridor of the executive wing, where silence replaced music and the air felt different, heavier, like a pause before a storm. Suite 1703, his assistant had said, but the numbers blurred for a fraction of a second as his mind replayed the boardroom tensions he'd left behind, and without hesitation, he pressed the card key against the wrong door, the soft click echoing louder than it should have. And when the door opened, the world he knew shifted, because the room was not empty. She stood there in the low amber light near the edge of the bed, still, composed, her deep brown skin glowing softly under the dim lamp, her posture neither defensive nor welcoming, just present, as if she had already calculated his presence before he even entered. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching, deliberate, charged, not with fear but with awareness. Ethan's gaze sharpened instantly, scanning, assessing, expensive instincts kicking in, because this wasn't right, this wasn't protocol, and she did not belong to the curated perfection of this cruise. Not in the way the others did. Not dressed simply yet with a quiet elegance that didn't beg for attention, didn't perform, didn't need validation. "You're in the wrong room," she said finally, her voice steady, low, controlled, and something in that tone made Ethan pause, because it wasn't the voice of someone caught. It was the voice of someone who had already decided how this moment would go. His fingers hovered near his phone out of habit, authority ready to be summoned with a single call. "No," he replied, equally calm, equally measured, stepping further inside as the door clicked shut behind him, sealing the moment like a contract neither of them had signed. "I think you are." His eyes locked onto hers, gray meeting deep brown, power meeting something else entirely, something he couldn't immediately define, and that unsettled him more than anything, because uncertainty was a variable he eliminated, not entertained. Yet here she was, standing in a restricted suite she had no business occupying, and yet she didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't shrink. Instead, she held his gaze with a quiet defiance that felt dangerously close to truth. Footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway beyond the door, distant voices approaching, and for the first time, Ethan noticed the subtle shift in her expression, not panic, not fear, but calculation, like a chess player seeing 3 moves ahead. "If you open that door," she said softly, her words precise, deliberate, "you won't just be fixing a mistake, a pause, just long enough to let the weight settle. You'll be making one." And something in the way she said it, something unspoken yet undeniable, made Ethan Blackwood, man who controlled outcomes, who predicted markets, who never stepped into the unknown, hesitate, just for a second. And in that second, the entire trajectory of his carefully constructed world began to shift. The silence did not break, it tightened like a wire pulled just short of snapping, and Ethan Blackwood felt it in the way the air shifted between them, in the way the distant footsteps outside seemed to grow louder with every second that passed. Yet neither of them moved, because this was no longer about a door or a mistake. This was about control, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan was not the only one holding it. His gaze narrowed, studying her again more carefully now, not as an intruder but as a variable that did not belong to any system. He understood her clothes were simple, but not careless, her posture relaxed, but intentional, and her eyes held something he had seen only in boardrooms, when someone had nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. "Explain yourself," he said quietly, the words not raised but sharpened, carrying the weight of authority that usually ended conversations before they began. But Naomi Carter did not flinch. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering him, not his words, but him measuring something unseen. "If I explain," she replied, her voice calm, steady like a glass surface hiding depth beneath, "you will not believe me." Another step echoed outside, closer, now a voice calling out a name, not hers, not his, but close enough to matter. Ethan's jaw tightened. He did not like unknown timelines. He did not like being placed inside someone else's situation without preparation. And yet here, he was standing in a room that was not his with a woman who clearly knew more than she was saying, and still he did not reach for the door. "Try me," he said, and this time there was something different beneath the words, not impatience, not anger, something quieter, something that surprised, even in interest. Naomi's eyes flickered just for a fraction of a second, not fear, not relief, recognition, as if she had expected that answer all along. "I am not supposed to be seen here," she said simply, no dramatic pause, no elaborate explanation, just truth delivered without decoration, and that was what made it dangerous. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that usually came before a decision that could not be undone. "That much is obvious," he replied, but his voice had lowered, matching hers, now controlled, measured, aligned. The footsteps stopped. Outside the door, a brief silence, then a soft knock, not urgent, not aggressive, but deliberate. Naomi did not turn toward it. She did not even blink. Her focus remained on Ethan, as if the rest of the world had already been accounted for. "If you open it," she said again, softer now, but firmer, "they will ask questions, and you will have to answer them." Ethan glanced toward the door, just once, calculating distance, timing, consequences, every outcome, branching in his mind like a network of possibilities. This was what he did. This was who he was. He solved problems before they became visible. But this was different because the problem was already here, already inside the room, already looking at him with eyes that did not ask for permission. "And if I do not?" he asked, his gaze returning to hers, locking again, testing the boundary between logic and instinct. Naomi held that look without hesitation. "Then you will be choosing not to know," she said, and there it was, the shift, not in the room, not in the hallway, not in the distant ocean pressing against steel walls, but in him, because Ethan Blackwood had built his life on knowing, on uncovering, on controlling every hidden detail, and now he was being offered the opposite, not ignorance, but a choice to step away from control, and that was something he had never practiced. The knock came again, slightly firmer this time, followed by a voice more direct. "Sir, we need to confirm access for this suite." Ethan's phone remained in his hand, still unlocked, still ready, but he did not move his thumb, did not press the call button, did not open the door. Instead, he took one step closer to Naomi, closing the distance, not in aggression, but in decision, the kind that did not require explanation. "You have exactly 10 seconds, he said quietly, his voice dropping into something almost private, "to give me one reason why I should not open that door." Naomi did not rush. She did not fill the silence with panic. She simply looked at him fully now, as if this moment had always been inevitable. "Because the moment you do," she said, "you stop being the man who walks into the wrong room," a beat just enough to let the words settle, "and you become the man who chose what happens next." And for the first time that night, Ethan Blackwood did not hear the ocean, did not hear the voices outside, did not even hear his own thoughts. He heard only that sentence and the weight of it pressing against everything he believed about control, about power, about choice. And without realizing it, his hand slowly lowered away from the door handle. The knock stopped, and the silence that followed was heavier than before, as if the world outside the door had paused, waiting for a decision that neither of them could take back. And Ethan Blackwood felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not fear, not doubt, something quieter and far more dangerous, uncertainty, because for the first time the outcome was not entirely his to control. His hand remained suspended for a moment longer before slowly dropping to his side, and that single movement shifted everything. Naomi saw it immediately, not just the action, but the meaning behind it. Her shoulders did not relax, but her breathing changed just slightly, as if a line had been crossed, one that could not be uncrossed. The voice outside the door spoke again, more formal, now more official. "Sir, we need confirmation, please." Ethan turned his head just enough to acknowledge the sound, but he did not answer. Instead, his attention returned fully to Naomi, and there was no hesitation left in his gaze, only a decision already made. "You have two options," he said quietly, his tone no longer cold, but precise, deliberate, the voice of a man rewriting the terms of a situation in real time. You walk out of here with me, or you stay and deal with whatever is on the other side of that door. Naomi studied him closely as if searching for something beneath the words, something hidden in the spaces between his sentences, because men like him did not offer options, they issued outcomes, and yet here he was offering her a choice she had not expected, and that alone made it dangerous. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different, no longer tense, but calculated, both of them aware that every second mattered. The door handle shifted slightly from the outside, not opened, but tested, a subtle reminder that time was narrowing. Naomi's eyes flickered once toward the door, then back to Ethan, and in that brief glance he saw it clearly now, not fear, but pressure, the kind that came from being cornered by circumstances that did not allow mistakes. If I walk out with you, she said slowly, choosing each word with care, then I become part of your world. A beat, her voice lowered just enough to carry weight. And your world does not forgive what it does not understand. Ethan did not look away, neither does yours, he replied, and there it was, the recognition, unspoken but undeniable, that whatever she was running from was not simple, not temporary, and certainly not something that would disappear once the ship reached shore. The air between them shifted again, this time not with tension, but alignment. Two people standing on opposite sides of a decision that was already pulling them toward the same outcome. Another knock, sharper, now followed by a different voice, one with authority layered beneath politeness. Mr. Blackwood, we know you are inside. The use of his name landed like a quiet signal, and Naomi's expression changed for the first time, not in fear, but in realization. She had not known who he was, not fully, and now she did. Ethan caught the shift instantly. That changes things, she said softly, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Ethan's jaw tightened, just slightly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement, because she was right. It did change things. His name carried weight, influence, consequences, and now it was no longer just a door or a mistake. It was a situation with visibility, with implications that would not stay contained. Everything changes something, he replied, his voice steady, but lower now, closer to hers. The question is what you do with it. Naomi held his gaze for a long moment, longer, as if measuring not his power, but his intent, and then without another word, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to signal a decision made. Ethan did not move back, he did not step aside. He simply watched as she reached for the jacket draped over the chair beside him, a simple dark piece that contrasted against her skin, and without asking, she slipped it on the fabric, falling slightly oversized around her shoulders, but fitting the moment perfectly, not as protection, but as transformation. The knock came again, louder now, the pressure no longer subtle. Ethan exhaled, once controlled, final, and then turned toward the door, his hand lifting, not hesitating this time. Naomi stood beside him, not behind, not hidden, but present, and when he finally reached for the handle, the world on the other side was no longer something he was stepping into alone. It was something they were both choosing together, and as the door began to open just enough to let the light from the hallway spill into the room, Ethan Blackwood understood with absolute clarity that whatever came next would not be a mistake anymore. The door opened just enough for the corridor light to cut through the dim suite like a blade of gold, and Ethan Blackwood did not step back, he stepped forward, because hesitation no longer belonged in this moment. The man outside straightened immediately, his posture shifting from authority to controlled respect. The instant recognition settled in. Mr. Blackwood, he said, his tone careful, measured, as two uniformed security officers stood just behind him, their presence subtle but unmistakable. Ethan's expression did not change, his gaze steady, his voice even. There seems to be some confusion about this suite, he said, not as an explanation, but as a conclusion. Already decided. The man nodded, quickly glancing past Ethan for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. He saw Naomi standing there wrapped in Ethan's jacket, and that single detail rewrote the entire situation in his mind. Assumptions formed instantly, not spoken, but understood. Of course, sir, the man replied, stepping back half a pace. We were verifying access after an irregular signal from this room. Ethan's hand remained on the door, not fully opening it, not fully closing it, control maintained in the smallest movement. And now it is verified, he said simply, the words leaving no space for further questions. The silence that followed was brief, but heavy, the kind that existed when protocol met power and knew which one would yield first. The man inclined his head. Yes, sir, he said, and with a subtle gesture the officers stepped back, their presence dissolving into the corridor as if they had never been there at all. Ethan gave a single nod and closed the door with deliberate calm, the soft click sealing the moment again, but this time it felt different, not uncertain, not fragile, but chosen. When he turned back, Naomi had not moved. She stood where he left her, but something in her expression had shifted, not relief, not gratitude, something more complex, something that did not come easily to her. "You did not have to do that," she said, her voice quiet but firm, as if acknowledging a truth she did not fully trust. Ethan walked past her slowly, not dismissing her words, but not answering them immediately either. He moved toward the window, the vast dark ocean stretching beyond the glass, a reminder that some forces could not be contained, only navigated. "I did not do it for you," he said finally, his reflection faint against the night. "I did it because I do not like incomplete information." Naomi studied him from where she stood, the oversized jacket falling slightly from one shoulder, but she did not adjust it. She did not perform comfort or vulnerability. She simply remained present. "Then you should ask better questions," she replied. And there it was again, that quiet resistance, not defiance, not challenge, something sharper, something that refused to be simplified. Ethan turned back toward her slowly, his eyes narrowing, just slightly, not in irritation, but in focus. "Who are you running from?" he asked, and this time it was not an assumption, it was precision. Naomi did not answer immediately. Her gaze flickered toward the door once more, as if measuring the distance between safety and exposure before returning to him. "I am not running," she said, but the words lacked the finality they were meant to carry. Ethan noticed it, the smallest fracture in an otherwise controlled voice, and he stepped closer again, not aggressively, not forcefully, just enough to close the space that had existed between them since the beginning. "Then they are looking for you," he said, and this time it was not a question. Naomi's silence confirmed more than any answer could. The room felt smaller now, not because of the walls, but because of the truth pressing against them, something unseen but undeniable. Ethan exhaled slowly, the decision forming not from impulse, but from instinct refined over years of navigating situations where the obvious answer was rarely the correct one. "You are not leaving this ship tonight," he said, and it was not a command, not entirely. It was a statement of fact. Naomi's eyes sharpened. "You do not decide that," she replied, but there was less resistance in her tone, now less certainty. Ethan did not react to the words. He simply held her gaze steady, unwavering. "No," he said quietly, "but I can decide what happens next." The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with something else, something that neither of them had planned, but both of them understood. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for the edge of his intention, and finding none that she could easily define. "And what happens next?" she asked finally, her voice softer now, not weaker, but more deliberate. Ethan did not answer immediately. He reached for his phone this time, not as a threat, not as control, but as a tool, and after a brief pause he sent a single message, the screen dimming as he lowered it again. "Now," he said, his voice calm, certain, "you stay where I can see you." Naomi did not smile. She did not argue. She simply absorbed the words, the meaning behind them, the shift in balance that had just taken place, and outside the ship continued forward through the dark ocean, cutting through waves that did not resist, because they understood something that neither of them had fully realized yet. This was no longer about a wrong door. This was about a path that had already begun to unfold. The message had already been sent, and whatever Ethan Blackwood had just set in motion did not belong to chance anymore. It belonged to him. And that was the difference. Naomi felt immediately, not in the room, not in the silence, but in the way he stood afterward, as if the situation had shifted from uncertainty into structure. She watched him carefully, her arms still at her sides, the oversized jacket carrying his presence more than warmth. "You make decisions quickly," she said, not as praise but as observation. Ethan slipped his phone into his pocket, his expression unchanged. "I make them when delay becomes a liability," he replied, his voice calm, but edged with something quieter, now something less about control and more about awareness. Naomi took a slow breath, her gaze drifting briefly to the window, where the dark ocean moved endlessly beneath them, a reminder that escape was not as simple as distance. "And what exactly am I now?" she asked, her tone measured. "A liability or an asset?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He studied her again, not as a threat, not as an anomaly, but as something that did not fit into categories he normally relied on. "That depends on what you are hiding," he said finally. Naomi's lips pressed together, not in refusal, but in restraint, as if the truth existed just beneath the surface, but revealing it would cost more than she was willing to pay. You assume I am hiding something. She replied. Ethan stepped closer again, not enough to invade, but enough to remove the illusion of distance. You are in a restricted suite on a ship you were not meant to access, and security is actively looking for you, he said, his voice even precise. That is not assumption, that is pattern. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer. And then something shifted again, not surrender, not confession, but a subtle recalibration, as if she had decided how much of the truth he was allowed to see. Then maybe the pattern is not about me, she said quietly. Maybe it is about what I saw. The words landed differently, not defensive, not evasive, but intentional, and Ethan felt it instantly, the shift from reaction to revelation. What did you see? He asked, and this time there was no edge in his voice, only focus. Naomi hesitated just long enough to make the silence meaningful before answering, something that was not supposed to happen on this ship. She said, her tone steady, but lower now, as if even the walls were not entirely safe, something that connects people who do not belong in the same room. Ethan's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened further, because now the situation had moved beyond her, beyond a simple question of identity, into something larger, something structured, something deliberate. And you think staying here makes you safer? He asked. Naomi shook her head slightly. No, she said, but leaving without understanding what it means would make it worse. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling into place, not chaotic, not unpredictable, but layered like a system with pieces that had not yet revealed their full design. Then we are not dealing with a mistake, he said, more to himself than to her. Naomi's eyes flickered with something that almost resembled agreement. We were never dealing with a mistake, she replied, and that was the moment it became clear, not just to Ethan, but to both of them, that whatever had brought him to that door had not been random. It had been alignment, not planned, but inevitable, the kind of alignment that changed direction. Without asking permission, Ethan walked back toward the door, his hand resting lightly against the surface, not to open it, not to close it, but to acknowledge it, the barrier between what was known and what was still unfolding. You said this involves people who should not be connected, he said, turning slightly toward her. Give me one reason why I should involve myself in something that does not belong to me. Naomi did not answer immediately. She took a step forward, closing the space between them just enough to shift the balance again, not equal, not controlled, but shared. Because you already did, she said, her voice quiet but certain. The moment you chose not to open that door, you became part of it. Ethan held her gaze, and for the first time since stepping into that room, he did not look for an exit, he looked for direction, and in that moment the ocean outside no longer felt like distance, it felt like isolation, like a world cut off from everything else, where decisions carried further, because there was nowhere for them to disappear. Then, we do this my way, he said finally, not as a demand, but as a framework. Naomi did not argue, she simply waited, and that told him more than any agreement could. You stay close, you tell me what you know, and you do not make a move without me knowing why. He continued, his voice steady, controlled, but no longer distant. Naomi studied him for a long moment, and then gave a single nod, not submission, not agreement, but acknowledgement of the path that had just been set. And what do you get out of it? She asked. Ethan's expression did not change, but something behind it did, something quieter, something that had not been there before. Answers, he said simply, and the word carried more weight than anything else in the room, because for a man like Ethan Blackwood, answers were never just information. They were leverage, and outside the ship continued its steady course through the dark water, unaware that somewhere inside it two strangers had just rewritten the rules of what would happen next. The room had changed without anything physically moving, and Ethan Blackwood recognized the shift immediately, because he had built his entire life on reading invisible transitions, the kind that happened before decisions became visible, before consequences took shape. And now that same awareness told him that whatever Naomi Carter had stepped into was not contained within this suite. It was already moving, already unfolding beyond these walls. He walked toward the console table near the entrance, his fingers brushing lightly against the polished surface as he thought, not distracted, not uncertain, but recalibrating. Start from the beginning, he said without turning, his voice calm, but carrying an expectation that did not invite avoidance. Naomi did not answer right away. She moved slowly toward the window, the reflection of the ocean stretching behind her like a second presence. And for a moment, she simply looked out, as if measuring how much of the truth belonged to the past, and how much had already become the present. I was not supposed to be on this level, she said finally, her tone steady, but quieter now, less guarded, but more deliberate. My access is limited to staff corridors and service decks. Ethan turned his head slightly enough to acknowledge her words without interrupting. Then something changed, he said. Naomi nodded once, her gaze still fixed on the dark horizon. I saw a transfer that did not match any official schedule, she continued. 2 passengers moved between secured areas without logging through the system. Ethan's attention sharpened instantly, not because of the action itself, but because of what it implied: a breach not in security, but in structure. And you followed it, he said. Naomi exhaled slowly. I should not have, she replied, not as regret, but as recognition. But it did not make sense, and I have learned that when something does not make sense, it usually means it matters. Ethan allowed a faint shift in his expression, not quite approval, but acknowledgement of logic. He understood. So you followed it, and ended up here, he said. Naomi turned back toward him, now her eyes steady, meeting his fully. No, she said, and the single word altered the entire frame. I followed it, and found something else. The silence that followed was not empty, it was focused, narrowing the space between question and answer. Ethan stepped closer again, his posture unchanged, but his attention fully aligned with hers. What? He asked. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, and then answered, not with hesitation, but with precision. A conversation that was not meant to be heard, she said. Names that should not be connected, agreements that do not belong on a civilian vessel. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, not in reaction, but in calculation, because now the pattern was clearer, not random, not isolated, but constructed, and that meant intention. And they saw you, he said. Naomi did not look away. Not at first, she replied, but they realized someone had accessed the corridor logs after the fact. Ethan nodded, once the pieces aligning in his mind faster now. Which is why security is not just verifying access, he said. They are narrowing down who should not be here. Naomi gave a slight nod, confirming what neither of them needed to say out loud. The room felt smaller again, but not from pressure this time, from clarity, the kind that removed illusion and replaced it with direction. Ethan walked past her, toward the window, standing beside her now, both of them facing the same dark horizon, but seeing entirely different things. You said this involves people who should not be connected, he said quietly. Give me one name. Naomi hesitated. Not because she did not know, but because saying it would cross a line that could not be undone. Ethan did not rush her. He did not repeat the question. He simply waited, and that patience carried more weight than any demand. Naomi finally spoke, her voice lower, now almost measured against the sound of the ocean. Victor Hale, she said, the name settling into the space between them like a signal. Ethan's expression did not change, but something behind it did, something sharper, something more focused. Because Victor Hale was not a name that appeared in random situations, it was a name that moved in controlled environments, in calculated operations, in places where visibility was managed, not exposed. He is not supposed to be on this ship, Ethan said. Naomi's eyes flickered slightly. Exactly, she replied, and that confirmation locked the situation into something far more complex than either of them had initially stepped into. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked the transition from observation to involvement, because now it was no longer a question of whether he was part of this, it was a question of how deeply it would go. Then this is not about you anymore, he said, turning his head slightly toward her. This is about what he is doing here and why it needed to stay hidden. Naomi studied him carefully, as if reassessing not the situation, but him, the man who had just crossed from controlled distance into active alignment. You asked what you get out of this, she said quietly. Now you know. Ethan did not respond immediately. He looked back out at the ocean, the dark water stretching endlessly forward, and for the first time that night, it did not feel like isolation. It felt like containment, like a space where something had been set in motion and there was no easy way to step outside of it. No, he said finally, his voice calm but certain. Now I know where to start. And in that moment, the path ahead was no longer uncertain. It was defined not by accident, not by mistake, but by a choice that had already begun to unfold beyond either of them. The name did not echo, it settled, and Ethan Blackwood understood exactly what that meant, because names like Victor Hale did not need volume. They carried weight on their own, the kind that moved quietly through systems. that never appeared on public records. He remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but his mind already shifting through layers of information, connecting patterns that did not normally intersect with civilian travel routes, with luxury environments, with anything that resembled a cruise ship. He does not make appearances without purpose. Ethan said finally, his voice low, controlled. Naomi watched him closely, now not just listening, but measuring how quickly he adapted to what she had revealed, because most people would have asked more questions, most people would have hesitated, but Ethan was already moving beyond surprise into structure. Then you understand why I could not ignore it, she replied. Ethan turned slightly toward her, his expression composed, but sharpened by something new, not curiosity, not caution, something closer to engagement. Understanding it and stepping into it are not the same decision, he said. Naomi held his gaze without hesitation. You already made that decision, she answered, and the truth of it did not challenge him. It aligned with what he already knew. The moment he had chosen not to open the door, he had stepped into something that would not remain contained within a single room. Ethan moved toward the console again, retrieving his phone this time, not to send a message, but to access information, his thumb moving with precision across the screen, pulling up secured contacts, data streams that did not belong to public networks. If Hale is here, then he is not alone. Ethan said more to the situation than to Naomi. And if he is not alone, then whatever is happening is coordinated, not accidental. Naomi nodded slightly, her posture still composed, but her attention now fully aligned with his. There were two voices, she said. One I recognized from internal communications, the other I did not. But the tone was not equal. Ethan glanced up from his screen briefly. Meaning? He prompted. Naomi stepped closer, not closing the distance fully, but enough to bring the conversation into a quieter space. Meaning one of them was giving instructions, and the other was confirming them. She said, this was not a discussion, it was execution. Ethan absorbed that without reaction, but the implication settled immediately. Not just a presence, not just a meeting, but an operation, and operations did not happen in environments like this unless they were meant to be hidden within plain sight. He lowered his phone slowly. The information he needed, not something that would appear instantly, but something he would access in layers over time. Then the ship is not just a location, he said, it is a cover. Naomi's eyes flickered with something that resembled agreement, but carried more weight than simple confirmation. That is what I believe, she replied. The silence that followed was not hesitation, it was alignment. Two people now looking at the same structure from different angles, but arriving at the same conclusion. Ethan moved toward the door again, not to open it, but to listen. The corridor beyond quieter, now the earlier presence of security reduced, but not gone, which meant observation had shifted from active verification to passive monitoring. They will not stop looking, Naomi said softly. Ethan nodded once. They do not need to, he replied. They already know enough to narrow it down. Naomi crossed her arms lightly, not in defense, but in thought. Then staying here only delays what happens next, she said. Ethan turned back toward her, his expression unchanged, but his focus absolute. Not if we move before they do, he said, and that was the shift, not waiting, not reacting, but acting within a window that had not yet closed. Naomi studied him again, and this time there was no resistance, no guarded distance, only calculation aligning with his. Where? She asked. Ethan glanced toward the screen of his phone once more, then back to her. There are sections of this ship that operate outside standard guest access, he said. Service corridors, maintenance decks, areas where movement is expected but not questioned. Naomi nodded slightly. I know them, she said, and that was the confirmation he needed, not just knowledge but access. Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket, his decision already formed. Then we do not stay where they expect us to be, he said. Naomi took a small step closer, now fully within his space, not hesitating, not uncertain. And if we find what he is doing, she asked. Ethan's gaze held hers steady, unwavering. Then we decide whether it stays hidden, he said, and the weight of that answer did not need further explanation because both of them understood the implication. This was no longer about avoiding attention, it was about uncovering something that was not meant to be seen. The ship continued forward, cutting through the dark ocean with silent precision, and somewhere within its structure something equally precise was unfolding, something hidden beneath layers of luxury and distance. And now, without announcement, without preparation, two people who had never planned to meet were moving toward it, not as observers, but as part of what would come next. The decision did not need to be spoken again because It had already taken shape in the space between them, and Ethan Blackwood moved first, not with urgency, but with intention, his hand reaching for the door handle and pausing for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but calculation. Naomi stepped beside him close enough now that their movements aligned without discussion, and when the door opened this time, it was not a mistake. It was a transition. The corridor outside was quieter than before, the distant hum of the ship replacing the earlier presence of security, but the absence of pressure did not mean safety. It meant observation had shifted somewhere unseen. Ethan stepped out first, his posture unchanged, his expression controlled, the image of authority intact, as if nothing in the past minutes had altered his course. Naomi followed half a step behind, not hidden, not exposed, simply integrated into his movement, as though she had always belonged there. The lighting along the hallway cast long reflections across the polished floor, each step measured, each sound absorbed into the quiet rhythm of the ship. "We cannot move like we are avoiding something," Ethan said under his breath, his voice low enough to remain contained between them. "Then we do not avoid it," Naomi replied, matching his pace, her tone steady. "We become part of what they expect to see." Ethan glanced at her briefly, not with surprise, but with recognition, because the strategy was sound, not reactive, but adaptive, the kind of thinking that did not come from fear, but from experience. They moved past a turn in the corridor, where the main guest wing shifted into a less visible section, the lighting dimmer, the atmosphere less curated. Here the illusion of luxury gave way to function, narrow pathways, service doors, panels that blended into the walls unnoticed by anyone who did not need to see them. Naomi slowed slightly, her attention shifting from the open corridor to the subtle markers that most would ignore. A maintenance panel left slightly ajar, a service cart position just off alignment, small details that suggested movement, not random, but purposeful. "This way," she said quietly, turning toward a side passage that appeared at first glance to lead nowhere. Ethan followed without question, because at this point the path was no longer about visibility, it was about access. The moment they stepped into the narrower corridor, the sound changed, the open echo of the main deck replaced by something more contained, more controlled. Footsteps carried differently here, sharper, more precise. Naomi reached for a concealed handle along the wall, pressing it with practiced familiarity, and a narrow door opened seamlessly, revealing a service passage beyond. The shift was immediate, the lighting cooler, the air different, less filtered, less designed. This was the structure beneath the surface, the part of the ship that did not perform for anyone. Ethan stepped inside first, his gaze scanning automatically, noting exits, pathways, blind spots, every detail aligning into a map that formed almost instantly in his mind. Naomi followed, closing the door behind them with quiet precision, sealing them into a space that operated outside the curated world above. "How far does this run?" Ethan asked, already moving forward. Naomi walked beside him, now their pace steady but controlled. "It connects most of the lower decks and restricted areas," she said. "If they are moving something without being seen, this is where it happens." Ethan nodded, once the logic clear, the pattern consistent. This was not improvisation, this was design. They continued down the passage, the distant hum of machinery growing slightly louder as the ship moved forward, the vibration beneath their feet steady, constant, a reminder that they were not just navigating space, they were inside something that was already in motion. Naomi slowed again, her hand lifting slightly, signaling pause. Without words, Ethan stopped immediately, his awareness sharpening further as he listened, and then he heard it, voices faint but present, not from the corridor ahead, but from a junction just beyond the next turn. Naomi glanced at him once, and he understood the exchange. Without language, they moved closer, not rushing, not hesitating, each step placed with intention, until the voices became clearer, not loud, not careless, but controlled, exactly as she had described earlier, one voice leading the other, confirming. "The timing stays unchanged," the first voice said, low, precise. "No deviations once we reach the transfer point." A second voice responded, "Understood, all variables are aligned." Ethan's gaze shifted to Naomi, and in that brief moment the confirmation passed between them. This was it, not theory, not assumption, but proof, something structured, something deliberate unfolding within the hidden layers of the ship. Naomi's breathing remained steady, her posture composed, but her focus absolute. Ethan leaned slightly closer to the edge of the junction, just enough to observe without exposing himself. And there he saw them, two figures partially obscured by the dim lighting, one of them unmistakable, even without a clear view, the posture, the stillness, the controlled presence. Victor Hale. Ethan withdrew just enough to remain unseen, his mind already moving ahead, mapping outcomes, assessing risk, calculating next steps. Naomi watched him closely, not asking, not interrupting, because whatever decision came next would not be made lightly. And in that moment, the path they had stepped onto became undeniable. They were no longer following something hidden, they were standing at the edge of it, and whatever came next would not allow them to remain observers. The voices did not rise, they did not rush, they moved with a precision that made every word feel intentional, and Ethan Blackwood remained still, just beyond the edge of visibility, his breathing controlled, his presence reduced to observation, because this was no longer about discovery, it was about confirmation. Naomi stood just behind him, her focus equally sharp, her posture unchanged, but her attention anchored to every sound, every shift in tone, every detail that might reveal more than the words themselves. The schedule is locked. Once we pass the midpoint, there is no adjustment. The first voice said, calm, unhurried, and Ethan did not need a clear view to recognize the authority behind it. Victor Hale did not speak to be heard, he spoke to be followed. The second voice responded immediately. All contingencies have been accounted for, there will be no deviation. A brief pause followed, not empty, but weighted, as if something unspoken had just been acknowledged. Ethan leaned back slightly, withdrawing just enough to avoid risk, his mind already moving through the implications, not just what was being said, but what was not. The midpoint, the transfer point, a sequence that suggested movement, not just of people but of something structured, something that required timing and control. Naomi's gaze shifted toward him for a fraction of a second, and in that glance they exchanged more than confirmation, they exchanged understanding. This was not a random meeting, this was a coordinated operation, and they were standing at the edge of it. We cannot stay here, Naomi whispered, barely audible. Ethan gave the slightest nod, not disagreement, but agreement layered with calculation. They needed more information, but not at the cost of exposure. He stepped back slowly, his movement deliberate, measured, ensuring that nothing in the corridor ahead would shift or react. Naomi mirrored him instinctively, the two of them retreating just enough to place distance between themselves and the voices, without breaking the thread of what they had just uncovered. Once they reached the bend in the passage, the sound softened again, reduced to a faint echo. Ethan exhaled, slowly, not relief, but transition, his focus shifting from observation to strategy. They are moving something at a fixed point, he said quietly. Naomi nodded, her expression composed, but more certain now. And whatever it is cannot be delayed, she added. Ethan glanced down the corridor ahead, mapping the structure mentally, the service routes, the intersections, the potential paths that would converge at whatever location Hale had referenced. If we find the transfer point, we find the purpose, he said. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. Or we find ourselves exactly where they expect interference to happen, she replied. Ethan considered that for a moment, not dismissing it, not ignoring it, because she was not wrong. Operations like this did not leave open paths without accounting for who might take them. Then we do not approach it directly, he said. Naomi tilted her head slightly. What are you suggesting? Ethan's gaze returned to hers, steady, precise. We let them lead us to it without knowing we are following. Naomi studied him carefully, the strategy forming between them, not spoken in full, but understood in pieces. That means staying close enough to track movement, but far enough to remain invisible, she said. Ethan gave a slight nod. And it means anticipating where they go next before they move. Naomi glanced back toward the direction of the voices, then forward again toward the branching corridor ahead. There is a junction 2 levels down that connects to the cargo access points, she said. If there is a transfer, it would have to pass through there. Ethan absorbed that instantly, the map in his mind, adjusting, recalibrating the path ahead. Then, that is where we go, he said. Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second, not from doubt, but from awareness. Once we move further down, we lose the option to return unnoticed, she said. Ethan did not look away. We lost that option the moment we stepped into this, he replied, and the finality of that statement settled between them, not as pressure, but as clarity. Naomi gave a single nod, her decision aligning with his without resistance. Then we do not hesitate, she said. Ethan turned toward the deeper passage, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly from observation to action. No, he said quietly, we do not. And with that, they moved forward, not rushed, not reckless, but with a precision that matched the structure they had just uncovered. The ship continued its silent course through the night, unaware that beneath its surface two unseen paths were beginning to converge. One planned, one discovered, both moving toward the same point where something hidden would no longer remain out of sight. The deeper they moved, the more the ship revealed its true structure, not the polished illusion of glass and light, but the hidden framework beneath it. Corridors narrowed, ceilings lowered, the hum of machinery growing more present, more constant, like a heartbeat that never stopped. Ethan Blackwood adjusted his pace, instinctively, not faster, not slower, but aligned with the rhythm of the space, because environments like this were not meant for hesitation. Naomi moved beside him, her familiarity with the layout guiding them. Without hesitation, each turn chosen with quiet precision, until the passage shifted again, opening slightly into a wider junction where multiple service routes converged. The lighting here was dimmer, more functional, shadows resting in the corners where the walls met the floor, and the air carried a faint metallic edge. "This is where it connects," Naomi said softly, her voice contained but certain. Ethan scanned the area immediately, his gaze moving across the intersections, the access panels, the subtle markings that indicated routes invisible to anyone without reason to notice. "If they are transferring something, it will pass through one of these points," he said. Naomi nodded, but her attention had already shifted toward the far side of the junction, where a secondary corridor extended downward at a slight angle, leading toward the lower decks. "Cargo access is below that level," she said, "and anything that requires discretion would move through there, not above." Ethan followed her line of sight, the structure aligning in his mind, the voices they had heard, the timing, the reference to a midpoint, everything narrowing toward a single direction. "Then we move before they do," he said. Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but awareness. "If they are ahead of us, we risk crossing into their path directly," she said. Ethan turned slightly toward her, his expression composed but decisive. "Then we do not cross it, we anticipate it," he replied, and without waiting for further confirmation, he stepped toward the descending corridor, his movement deliberate, his posture unchanged. Naomi followed immediately, not questioning, not delaying, because at this point the path forward was no longer about safety, it was about precision. The corridor sloped downward gradually, the sound of the ship shifting as they moved closer to its operational core, the hum of engines more pronounced, the vibration beneath their feet steadier, more grounded. And then they heard it again, not voices this time, but movement, controlled, deliberate footsteps approaching from below. Ethan stopped instantly, his hand lifting slightly, signaling pause. Naomi mirrored him without hesitation, both of them stepping back into the shadow of the junction, just enough to remain unseen, but close enough to observe. The footsteps grew clearer, measured, unhurried, and then two figures emerged into view from the lower passage, one of them unmistakable, even in partial light. Victor Hale, his presence unchanged, his posture composed, his movements carrying the same quiet authority Ethan had recognized before. But this time, there was something else, not in Hale, but in what accompanied him, a secured case, carried by the second man, not large, not conspicuous, but handled with a level of care that suggested importance, not weight, but value. Ethan's gaze narrowed, not in reaction, but in calculation, every detail registering instantly: the size of the case, the positioning, the pace of movement, the direction they were heading, all of it aligning into a pattern that was no longer theoretical. Naomi's eyes remained fixed on the case, her expression steady, but sharpened by recognition, not of the object itself, but of what it represented. "That is it," she whispered, barely audible. Ethan did not respond, his attention fully anchored to the movement ahead as Hale paused briefly at the center of the junction, his gaze sweeping once across the surrounding corridors, not searching, not uncertain, but verifying. And in that moment, Ethan understood something critical. Hale did not expect interference, not here, not now, which meant whatever was about to happen was operating under the assumption of control, and that was the vulnerability. Ethan waited until the two figures moved past the junction, continuing toward an adjacent corridor that led further into the restricted cargo zone. Only then did he shift his position, stepping forward just enough to follow at a distance that remained outside direct line of sight. Naomi moved with him seamlessly, her pace matched to his, their presence reduced to shadows within a system that was not designed to detect them at this level. "We stay behind them," Ethan said quietly. Naomi nodded, her focus unwavering. "If they reach the transfer point, we will know exactly what they are moving." She replied, the path ahead narrowed again, the lighting dimmer, the structure more industrial. Now, less concealed, less refined, and as they moved deeper, the realization settled between them, not spoken, but understood. They were no longer approaching the operation, they were inside it. And whatever waited at the end of this corridor would not just reveal the purpose, it would define what came next. The corridor narrowed again as Ethan Blackwood and Naomi Carter moved deeper into the lower decks, the air cooler, the hum of machinery louder, like a constant reminder that everything here operated beneath the surface, unseen, unnoticed. The figures ahead maintained their pace, steady, controlled. Victor Hale, never once looking back, because he did not expect to be followed. And that certainty was what made this possible. Ethan adjusted their distance instinctively, keeping just enough space to remain outside peripheral awareness while never losing visual contact. The secured case remained the focal point, not because of its size, but because of the precision with which it was handled. Naomi's gaze stayed locked on it, as well her expression calm, but intent, as if every step brought her closer, not just to an answer, but to confirmation. They reached another junction where the corridor opened into a larger service bay. The lighting harsher here, the space more exposed. Rows of equipment lined the walls, and a reinforced door stood at the far end, marked only by a small access panel that blended into the metal surface. Hale slowed slightly, not hesitating, but aligning his movement with the man beside him, who stepped forward and placed his hand against the panel. A brief pause followed, and then a soft mechanical click, the door unlocking. Without sound, Ethan stopped immediately, pulling Naomi gently back into the shadow of a structural column just before the open space. Their movement seamless, silent, as Hale and the second man entered the secured area, the door closing behind them with the same quiet precision. Naomi exhaled slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. That is the transfer point. Ethan nodded, once his gaze fixed on the now closed door, his mind already moving ahead through possibilities, entry points, timing, risks, the structure of the space they could not yet see. Then whatever is inside that case is not staying on this ship, he said. Naomi's eyes flickered toward him. Or it is arriving here to be hidden, she replied. Ethan considered that for a moment, both possibilities carrying equal weight, neither one simple. The silence stretched as they stood there, the ship continuing its steady motion around them, unaware of what was unfolding beneath its surface. We cannot wait too long, Naomi said quietly. If they complete the transfer, we lose the only chance to understand what this is. Ethan did not look away from the door. And if we move too soon, we risk being seen before we know enough, he replied. Naomi's jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in focus. Then we find a way to see without being seen, she said. Ethan allowed a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but recognition of the alignment between them. That is exactly what we do, he said. He moved along the edge of the service bay, his steps controlled, his attention scanning the surrounding structure until he found it, a secondary access hatch partially concealed behind a row of equipment, its panel slightly misaligned, not broken, but used. Naomi followed his movement immediately, her eyes narrowing as she saw what he had found. Maintenance access, she said softly. It should connect to the same chamber from above. Ethan placed his hand against the panel, testing it, not forcing, not rushing, and after a brief moment it gave way, opening just enough to reveal a narrow passage beyond. Then we do not enter through the door they used, he said. Naomi stepped closer, her presence steady beside him. We take the path they are not watching, she replied. Ethan glanced at her, once a brief exchange that carried more than agreement, before he moved into the passage, the space tighter, the air heavier, the sound of the ship's systems louder. Here, less filtered, more raw. Naomi followed, closing the panel behind them with careful precision, sealing them into a route that existed parallel to the one below. They moved forward slowly, the narrow passage leading them above the secured chamber. And then the sound reached them again, voices clearer, now not through distance, but through proximity. Ethan stopped, lowering himself slightly, to look through a narrow opening in the metal below, and there it was, the chamber beneath them, larger than the corridor had suggested, structured, controlled, the secured case now placed at the center of a reinforced table. Victor Hale, standing beside it, his presence unchanged, his posture composed, as another figure approached from the opposite side, not part of the earlier movement, not expected. Naomi leaned closer, her gaze following Ethan's line of sight, and the moment she saw the second figure, her expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for Ethan to notice something deeper than recognition, something closer to realization. That is not supposed to happen. She whispered. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the scene below, his voice low, controlled. Then we are looking at something that was never meant to be seen at all. And in that moment, as the chamber below came fully into view, the operation no longer hidden, the truth, no longer theoretical, Ethan Blackwood understood with absolute clarity that whatever was inside that case was only part of the equation. The real question was who it was being handed to and why it had to happen here. The figure stepped fully into the light, and the shift in Naomi Carter was immediate, not visible to anyone who did not know what to look for, but undeniable to Ethan Blackwood, who had learned long ago that the smallest reactions often carried the greatest truth. Her breathing did not change, her posture did not falter, but her focus sharpened into something far more precise than curiosity. You recognize them, Ethan said. Quietly, his voice controlled, but no longer neutral. Naomi did not answer right away, her eyes fixed on the person across from Victor Hale, as if confirming something she had hoped was not true. I was not supposed to, she replied finally, her tone lower, now more contained, as if each word had to pass through a decision before being allowed to exist. Below them, the chamber remained silent, except for the controlled exchange unfolding. Victor Hale did not rush, he never did. His presence alone dictated the pace, and the second figure standing opposite him carried a different kind of authority, not equal, not mirrored, but aligned in purpose. Everything remains within parameters, the second figure said, their voice calm, deliberate. No external variables have been introduced. Hale inclined his head slightly, not agreement, but acknowledgement. And yet we are here, he replied, his tone unchanged, but carrying a subtle weight that suggested awareness beyond the words. Ethan's gaze narrowed slightly as he absorbed the exchange, not just what was being said, but how it was being said. This was not a routine transfer, this was verification layered with caution, which meant something about this operation required absolute precision. Naomi leaned slightly closer, her voice barely audible. That person should not have access to Hale, not directly, not like this. Ethan did not look away from the scene below. Then this is not just a transfer, he said. It is a convergence. Naomi's eyes flickered briefly toward him and then back to the chamber. Yes, she said, and the word carried more than confirmation. It carried implication. The secured case rested at the center of the table, untouched, but central to everything, as if its presence alone defined the interaction. Hale gestured, once subtle, controlled, and the second man who had carried the case stepped forward, placing a small device against its surface. A soft light appeared, scanning, not opening, not revealing, but confirming something within. Ethan leaned slightly closer, his attention fixed. Biometric lock, he murmured. Naomi nodded. Not just security, she added, authorization. The scan completed with a faint tone, and the second figure stepped forward, now placing their hand against the case, the same light flickering again, this time responding differently, not scanning, but unlocking. A soft mechanical shift followed the case, opening just enough for something inside to activate, not visibly, not physically, but in a way that changed the atmosphere below, as if whatever was contained within had just been acknowledged. Ethan felt it, not as a sound, not as a sight, but as a shift in the precision of the moment. This was the point, not the movement, not the delivery, but the confirmation. Naomi's voice came quieter, now almost to herself. It is not what is inside the case, she said. It is what the case confirms. Ethan glanced at her, briefly recognizing the realization forming identity. He said. Naomi nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving the chamber, or access to something beyond this ship. Below them, the second figure withdrew their hand, the case closing again with the same quiet precision. Hale remained still for a moment longer, as if evaluating not the object, but the outcome. Then he spoke. It proceeds as planned. He said the words simple but final. The second figure gave a slight nod, no hesitation, no further discussion, and turned away, moving toward a secondary exit on the far side of the chamber, one that had not been visible from the corridor above. Ethan's attention followed the movement, instantly mapping the new path, the additional exit, the expanded structure of the operation. There is another route, he said. Naomi's expression tightened slightly. That means this was never meant to stay in one place, she replied. Ethan exhaled slowly, the realization settling into clarity. This was not a single transfer, this was a system, a sequence designed to move something through layers without detection, and now they were inside it. We follow that exit, he said quietly. Naomi hesitated for the first time, not from fear, but from understanding. If we do that, we are no longer observing, she said. We are entering the chain. Ethan's gaze returned to the chamber below, where Hale remained, his presence unchanged. His control absolute. We already entered it, he replied. Naomi looked at him, then not at the scene, not at the movement, but at him, as if reassessing the decision they had stepped into, and for the first time since this began there was no resistance in her expression, only alignment. Then we do not stop here, she said. Ethan gave a slight nod, his decision already set, and as the figure below disappeared through the secondary exit, and Hale turned to follow the path ahead, became clear, not simple, not safe, but defined. And in that moment the choice was no longer whether to continue, it was how far they were willing to go before the truth revealed itself completely. The moment Victor Hale turned toward the secondary exit, the entire structure of the situation shifted from observation to inevitability, and Ethan Blackwood did not hesitate, because hesitation no longer belonged in this space. He moved first, pulling back from the narrow opening and stepping forward along the upper passage, his direction already aligned with the route below. Naomi followed immediately, her pace matched to his without instruction, because at this point there was no separation between their decisions. The path ahead was no longer hidden, it was unfolding in real time, and they were inside it. The passage curved slightly, then descended again, connecting to a parallel corridor that mirrored the lower route, but remained just out of direct visibility. The sound of movement below continued steady, controlled. Hale and the others advancing without pause. Ethan adjusted his pace again, maintaining position, not too close, not too distant, just enough to remain aligned without being detected. They are not slowing down, Naomi said quietly, her voice calm but focused. Ethan nodded, once his gaze forward, his mind already mapping the intersections ahead. Because they are not expecting interference, he replied. Naomi glanced at him briefly. Or because they believe there is none. Ethan allowed a faint shift in his expression. Not quite agreement, not quite dismissal. Those are the same assumption, he said, and the weight of that statement settled between them. As they continued forward, the corridor opened again, this time into a narrower junction that connected directly to the secondary exit below. The sounds became clearer, footsteps, measured, voices controlled, and then the figures reappeared in view through a partial opening. Victor Hale, moving with the same quiet authority, the secured case now in motion again, carried forward with purpose, the second figure walking ahead, guiding the direction, not leading, not following, but coordinating. They are heading toward the aft section, Naomi said softly. Ethan's gaze followed the path, instantly aligning it with the ship's structure. That leads to restricted loading points, he said. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. On a civilian cruise ship, she added. Ethan did not respond immediately, because the implication did not need words. This was no longer just a hidden operation, it was something embedded within a system that should not allow it. They continued to follow the parallel route, the distance between them and the figures below maintained with precision, each turn, each shift in direction anticipated rather than reacted to, until the corridor narrowed once more and then stopped at a final junction where the path ahead split into two, one continuing forward, the other descending sharply toward the lowest deck. Ethan paused for the first time, not out of uncertainty, but calculation, his gaze shifting between the two options. Naomi stepped beside him, her attention equally focused. If they go down, we lose visibility from this level, she said. Ethan nodded once. But if we stay above, we lose proximity, he replied. Naomi exhaled slowly, the decision forming between them, not spoken, but understood. The sound of movement below shifted again, footsteps angling downward, confirming the direction without hesitation. Ethan stepped toward the descending path, his choice made. Naomi followed without question. The air changed immediately as they moved lower, cooler, denser, the hum of the ship's engine stronger, now less distant, more present, like a force surrounding them rather than something beneath them. The corridor here was narrower, more confined, the structure less refined, more industrial. This was the core, not meant for guests, not meant to be seen, and yet this was where everything was leading. They reached the end of the passage, where it opened into a final observation point, a narrow overlook that revealed the space below. And what they saw there was not what Ethan had expected. The chamber was larger than any they had passed before, not a simple transfer point, but a controlled loading bay, reinforced structure designed for movement beyond the ship. The figures stood at its center, Victor Hale, composed, as always, the secured case now positioned near a platform that extended toward an external access point. And then Ethan saw it, not a vessel, not a visible exit, but a system embedded into the structure itself, something designed to transfer Without detection, without exposure, Naomi's voice came barely above a whisper. This is not about the ship at all. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the scene below, his mind already moving ahead beyond what was visible. No, he said quietly. This is about where it goes next. The second figure activated something along the platform, a faint shift in the structure, a sequence beginning, not dramatic, not visible to anyone outside this space, but precise, controlled, inevitable. Hale remained still, watching not the mechanism, but the outcome. And in that moment, Ethan understood the full scale of what they had stepped into. This was not a single transfer. This was a link in something far larger, something that extended beyond the ship, beyond the ocean, beyond anything that could be contained within a single location. Naomi looked at him, then her expression no longer questioning, no longer uncertain. If this continues, it disappears, she said. Ethan did not look away from the unfolding sequence below. Then we decide whether it does, he replied, and the weight of that decision settled between them, not as pressure, but as purpose, because this was no longer about following or observing. It was about what came next, and whether they were willing to step fully into it before the truth vanished beyond reach.